All right. Hey, what's happening? This is Luke with LukeHumphreyRunning.com. Welcome to the podcast. Again, I apologize. We haven't been as regular, but we've been working on a lot of stuff. So it took a back seat again, but trying to, again, get regular. I'm not going to completely abandon. I want to keep rocking with that. But in any case, so I came across an article a couple days ago in my email. I've talked about this company website for a while. It's Sports Medicine Bulletin.com. And you can get a few free articles and then, they direct you to a paywall, which is, not a problem. I'm just saying that you may or may not be able to view the actual article that just came out. But excuse me, it was the premise of the article. So they were looking at a new research that just came out, and they were looking at variables that changed over the course of time. And by time, I mean the course of a single workout. And, the basic premise of marathon performance, really any endurance performance, is that if you increase your VO2 max, your running economy, and your lactate threshold, you're going to increase performance. And that's true, 100% true. But why are people fading, really like not necessarily hitting the wall, but fading, right? And so what they wanted to do was look at how those variables changed over time during the course of, a long run or the marathon itself. And, and honestly, you just can't assume. And I think sometimes we do that those variables are set and they're not going to change in a single run, even though just time that we're on our feet is so much. In fact, that those numbers are just going to change over the course of the time that we're running. And in any case, they looked at those variables. They wanted to look at how those variables held up over time. And so what they did was they looked at 18 men and women, the average marathon time of 3 hours and 17 minutes. They were injury free, and they averaged a weekly volume of 75 kilometers per week, roughly 45 miles per week. And they did 2 tests within 6 weeks of the London Marathon just to make sure they were fit, they were ready to go, and able to perform. And so the first test that they did, and they did these over the span of, they didn't do them at the same time. They were over the span of a week or two. And they did an incremental test. So if you've ever done a graded exercise test for cardiologist, got your VO2 max tested, whatever, same idea. What they did here was they started at 70% of their 70% of their marathon pace, which should be pretty comfortable for most people. And it should be comfortable if you're training for a marathon. And then every 4 minutes, they increased it 1 kilometer per hour. And then they went until they couldn't anymore. They voluntarily stopped the test. And then they were able to get blood lactate level. They did all that good stuff along the way. And then the second test they did was a 90-minute bout of, air quotes, difficult running, which was, I think, essentially lactate blood. They were checking blood lactate levels every so often. But it was, it wasn't easy by any stretch of the imagination. And then after that 90 minutes, they came back and did the 90-minute incremental test, right? And that was where they wanted to look at the numbers to see how different they were from when they were fresh, and did the incremental test. And so what they found was that peak VO2 significantly decreased, the speed that they were running at lactate threshold decreased, and the oxygen uptake at threshold decreased. So basically VO2 max decreased, speed of LT, or the running economy, everything decreased, right? All those variables we just talked about were decreasing. I take that back. Actually, they found that economy stayed the same. But what they were saying in there, I was trying to completely understand it, was basically the fact that everything decreased at the same proportion. So it made the economy look pretty similar to what it had been before. So, but economy held up well, but it held up, but the other numbers decreased, which is showing a decrease in performance. Some of the other things they found was that VO2 peak correlated highly with marathon performance, as did economy and lactate threshold, which basically means the higher those numbers are, the more likely you're going to be able to perform better. But doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to not see a decrease in performance, right? So just having that baseline isn't going to be enough. And the last thing that they found was people with the smallest decrease in speed at LT had the best performance in the marathon, right? Which is to be expected, right? The higher you can maintain that speed without producing a ton of lactic acid, the more likely you're going to be able to sustain a higher speed throughout the course of a marathon. So overall, in layman's terms, what they found was having a huge baseline in VO2 and all that other stuff is really important, but it's what is excuse me, really going to put you over the edge is how well you can maintain that baseline over the course of 90 minutes to 2 hours, 2.5 hours, right? And that's really, and when you look at it, when that's really what we're looking at, right? Like when you're the first half of the marathon usually going pretty well, it's usually literally the last quarter of the marathon, last third of the marathon where the wheels start kind of falling off. And we always attribute that to fueling issues, and it's more this. I think what this shows is that it's more complex than that. Yes, fueling is a part of that, but it's not the thing that is really causing the decline in performance. And we've talked about this before where, this is, we see fades, but I wouldn't necessarily call them bonks. Bonks are where if you're running 630 miles and you have to start walking, that's a bonk. But if you're running 630s for the marathon and you slow down to 650, 7-minute pace, that's a fade, right? You're still able to run pretty well. Chances are mentally you're still in it, but you just physically can't keep that pace up anymore, right? And so, which is dangerous because that makes a lot of people think that they want to put time in the bank, but then ultimately I think that comes back to bite them a little bit. But in any case, I don't want to get too far off the rails here. Now, the authors of this in the Sports Medicine Bulletin, they seem to be putting it all on the long run. And what they did was they basically suggested that you need to include sessions that are 90 minutes up to an hour 20 in your training. But I feel like if you're listening to this podcast and you followed me at all, chances are you're not a true beginner. You're more, at least have run some running experience. Maybe you haven't run a marathon before, but you've done training before, all the way up to, pretty advanced runners. And so you're thinking about like, well, dude, I already do this, man. I don't need another long run, right? And I agree. I don't think you do either. I don't think that's necessarily the answer. I think that's a great step one. So I think if you are a beginner, that's where you need to put your focus on. Maybe not all this other stuff, but put your focus on increasing that long run duration to that point where it makes sense. Now that's not a shift in position to say that you automatically need 20 plus mile long runs. No, I don't think that's the case at all, because I think when you look at HMM and you look at, if you take a person running a 9-minute pace on their easy runs and they're doing a 16-mile long run, that's putting them well over 2 hours, plenty of stimulus to get what they need to push these adaptations that we're talking about. So again, I think that the long runs are a good step one, but I think as the more advanced you get, I think we kind of have to look at what else we can add to that. And I think that for me, I kind of started thinking about it. I think once you are well established with those long runs at a pretty easy pace, that's not an issue for you anymore. Then we start looking at increasing the pace of the long runs into that moderate and then into the long run zone that we have. If you've followed one of my plans, we talk about the long run pace range, and that's dips down to like 30 seconds slower than marathon pace, which is a pretty good clip. I think that would kind of be your step 2. And then your step 3 would be maybe adding a little bit more spice into your long runs as training goes on. And that could be as simple as adding in, 2 to 3 miles at the end of your long run at marathon pace, or as close as you can get to that. I think that puts you into a situation where you're really putting those legs under a situation where they're going to have to deal with fatigue and still run fast. For one, physically, I think that you push those adaptations on the VO2 max. The legs will become more resilient. They'll become more durable under that situation. But I also think mentally it puts you in a spot where you've been there before, and you know that you can do that even though you're tired. Mentally, you can kind of push through that. So I think that's a really good thing to look at. And then I think adding those fartleks or those types of things into your training can be a good thing as well, because you're just putting the body under a little bit more stress, forcing that adaptation, but not into a point where you can't recover and come back from that a few days later to do the next thing that we're supposed to do. And then ultimately too, I think that with HMM, I think that you're looking at a situation where late in the segment, you're doing the 16-mile long run, but then you're also doing the 10-mile tempo, which is going to be, for most people, depending on how far you warm up and cool down, going to be in a position where you're putting another 90-minute plus run on your legs. So you're really getting at least 2 opportunities a week to put yourself in that position where you're having 90+ minute runs. And I think that goes a long way in building that durability. But like I said, I don't necessarily think that's all of what we can do. So if you've never done those things before, I think that's a great place to start thinking about potentially adding in those things. But then ultimately, I go into fueling a little bit. I know I said that fueling is the end all be all, but I do think it comes into play because I think that, and I think that's why, one of the reasons why you're seeing that push for 90 to 120 grams of carbohydrates per hour. Now, I don't think that is necessarily the case for everybody. I think if you're, 345, 4 hours, 4+ hours, I don't think you need 90 grams, 120 grams of carbohydrate an hour. I think based on where you're at, I think, yes, you're going to burn a lot of carbohydrates, but you're also going to probably be at a position where you're still burning a lot of fat too. And so you don't necessarily need to supplement with a ton. And if you're taking, 30 to 60 grams, I think that's plenty to get you through, a 4.5 hour marathon. And I think when you look at the fast end of the spectrum there, you look at, okay, so if a person's running at 90% of their VO2 max, which means they're probably bumping up right next to their lactate threshold. Like, let's just say they're running at 85% of their lactate or their VO2 max, which probably puts them within a few percentage points of their lactate threshold. And what that means is that they're burning, 90% plus of what they're burning is coming from carbohydrates. They're not burning a lot of fat. So they need more carbohydrate just to sustain that needed energy, right? And that's where the difference, I think, comes in. So I think the faster you are, the more that fueling is going to come into play. And I think going into your training, like if you kind of fall apart on some of those longer long runs, heart rate starts, ramping up, pace starts slowing down. That's the first thing I would look at is how is your fueling during that? If you're not supplying enough carbs, then I think you will see that decline in performance over the course of the long run, which will then a lot of times translate into a decline in performance during the marathon because they haven't practiced it enough at the rates they want to practice at, and they just kind of go back. You never fall up in performance. You're going to fall back to what is your baseline. And if your baseline is just taking, a gel an hour, that's probably what you're going to fall back to because that's what you can tolerate and that's what's comfortable for you. So I really do think that, it does become a factor into that. The later you get into a race, the faster you are. And then lastly, I think this is where, my point is not to separate these out. My point is really kind of include all of these things at one, like looking at this holistically, right? Because I think one feeds into the other. And I've seen other studies in the past that have looked at similar decreases in performance, but they took other approaches. They looked at more of the issue from a structural standpoint, an actual muscular standpoint. They looked at their quad muscle breakdown after a marathon and and I remember reading this article and they found pacing fell way off and there was way more soreness for people who had more muscular damage. And it took them longer to recover after their marathon because they had more muscular damage to recover from. And that got me thinking about, when I was reading this article, it got me thinking about that article that I've seen several years ago. And it hits you like, okay, that's all related, right? Because if I'm breaking down muscle tissue, that means my mitochondria and all those cellular organisms are getting broken up. They're getting busted out of the muscle fiber, right? And everything's going to pot. And if that's going on the last, 10K to 15K of a marathon, so the last 6 to 10 miles of a marathon, what does that mean? Well, that means I don't have a place for glucose to go in anymore, right? Because the mitochondria is all jacked up. And then if I don't have glucose coming in to supply I'm trying to put glucose I'm trying to put the same amount of glucose into fewer muscle fibers because they're all broken down now. That means I can't, because you have a limiting rate supply, right? And so I can't do that. So I'm taking in less glucose into less number of mitochondria, which means I'm probably getting less oxygen production and getting less energy production from not being able to, take in the oxygen, supply the glucose, or I'm supplying that glucose into a more anaerobic. But again, because I have less muscle fiber, that's all doesn't make sense. It doesn't even matter anymore because it doesn't exist anymore. It's all, cell parts in my muscular system. And it's pretty wild too. I think it was something like people would see like 25% muscular damage in their quads, which, we see that every time after a marathon, right? Like just not being able to walk and all that stuff. But anyway, my point is, if you're trying to produce the energy we need, scratch it. So if those organelles don't exist anymore and they're not be able to take in the glucose, not be able to process the oxygen, then what's going to happen? Well, our VO2 is going to come down, right? Because we're not supplying enough. We're not supplying the same amount that we were, in the first 10 miles of the marathon. Now we're in the last 10 miles. We physically can't produce that same amount of energy, and we can't utilize the same amount of oxygen because those things don't exist anymore. And so what's going to happen? VO2 is going to come down. And since everything kind of trickles down from VO2, all of a sudden that other stuff's going to come down too. And so ultimately, to me, the more resilient you can make your legs, the better off you're going to be. So the simple leg strength that you can incorporate, goblet squats, air squats, do like a Brad Beer leg circuit, the Jay Johnson stuff, run strong, millions of stuff out there. I've added more strength training programs to our stuff just to do to build that resiliency. And I will tell you right now that the fastest people I have on my roster, I have several men right now. I don't know why I don't have any women right now, but Melissa has women too that are running pretty darn fast. And I will say that I'm thinking of 6 people in particular who have run between 240 and 250 in the marathon, really good pacers, hold up really well. And these aren't young guys. I mean, these are guys in their, late, well, 30s is young, but they're middle-aged guys, right? They're, youngest I would say is upper 30s, oldest is pushing 50. And we're talking about, they're all running under 250 in the marathon, 240 to 245 for the majority of them. But they all strength train. They all do basic strength training, and they are so resilient. They're not running 80 miles a week. They're running 60 to maybe 70 miles a week at peak, but they can do it week after week after week, and they hold up really, really well. And their splits prove it on race day. They don't fade. They don't lose more than 10 seconds a mile. So there is some negative splitting going on in there. But I really think it comes down to the strength training. So to me, I think that's part of it too. But I think it's all intertwined. I think the long runs, you obviously have to have the long runs, but I also think you also have to have the overall strength to make those muscles more resilient and durable to handle the long runs. And then ultimately over time, the long runs will be able to get longer because you can physically handle the long runs. Like I don't have any, like I said, I don't have anything against 20-mile plus long runs, but I also think that if you're a beginning runner and you've never run a marathon before, and you're trying to run a 20-miler, but your body starts breaking down at 12 to 14 miles, then you've gone past the point of allowing those adaptations to occur to just completely destroying your legs, right? And then it takes so long to recover. And I think this just shows it. This shows it in the study that, like, if your body, you want to take it to the point where it's just a little bit, but it's going to force adaptations. You don't want to take it so far beyond that you can't recover from that, right? And that's where I think the big thing is. But ultimately, I think all those things are intertwined, and I think those are the things you have to be looking at. So level 1, we start looking at how are our long runs, what can we add to our long runs, and then we start looking at the strength training too. And then strength training, unless you're 6 weeks out from a marathon, you can start with simple things like the Brad Beer leg circuit, same basic movements that are going to build that resiliency up. And then maybe the next segment, you start a full-fledged actual strength training program. And I promise you, if you can it doesn't have to be like all my routines. I specifically wanted them under 30 minutes so that, you can still keep your schedule. and just throw this in, and it doesn't seem so overwhelming. And that's really what we want, because a little bit will go a long way for most people. But in any case, I think it's those three things you look at. And if you can do those and you can avoid digging a hole so far that you can't get out of, you're going to see much better pacing for much longer during your marathon training. So I think it's interesting. Hopefully that helps some of you out, gives you some things to think about as you are starting to ramp up. If you're still in a situation where you're 10, 12 miles, 10, 12 weeks out from your marathon, hey, get a hold of me, reach out to me. Let's see where you're at. We can do a consult, something like that. We can point you in the right direction. Just kind of see, like, what should we tweak? What maybe we should switch around, whatever. Love to have a conversation with you. I'll leave some information down below. Also take a look. We're running some Labor Day stuff right now. If you haven't checked out the marathon project plans, I will leave those links below too. And I'll leave those links for you in show notes, wherever you're finding this. I don't know if it's going to be a video or a podcast, but we'll find those links for you. And yeah, hopefully that helps you out. But I think that's something to think about as you start ramping up for your big final push here. Biggest thing is don't dig holes you can't get out of. It's a lot of things that are intertwined. And again, just kind of reiterates, you have to look at training holistically. And honestly, it's just fun to see, like, you can kind of put a why this something is happening that we've all experienced. So in any case, I'll stop rambling. I'll talk to you later. See you later. Bye-bye.